All right. Hello, everyone. Today we are going to go over the notes from 4.4 ecosystem responses to disturbance. So we've been talking about a lot about population and species population, whether it's plants or animals, and how they survive and how they survive and reproduce and all these kind of things. This section deals a little more with obviously the ecosystem responses in general. So like sort of on a larger scale. So it starts off with equilibrium theory. We've talked about equilibrium before. It's finding a balance, right? So it says that ecosystems are relatively stable environments in which species interact constantly in well-balanced predator-prey and competitive relationships. So that constant back and forth between predator prey and the other competitive relationships keeps everything in an ecosystem in a relatively stable balance. Okay. All right. Excuse me. So, excuse me. There's something in an ecosystem called ecological or natural succession. It's a transition from one biotic community to another. So, transition refers to changing. Biotic is living. So it's where the living community in an ecosystem switches from one thing to another. The community of life in general. This is not talking about just one species. Okay, so it's talking about all the living things, and it sort of switches from one thing to another over time. It breaks succession up into two categories: primary and secondary. So primary succession, the process of initial invasion into an ecosystem with no biotic community or soil base. So for example, you have bare rock or gravel. You then get moss invading and allowing a soil base to build. So you have something with no soil at all. And it's the initial process of building a soil base. That's all. That's all primary succession is. Okay, now, how do you get something with primary succession? Like, what would set something to that point? Well, there's really sort of two things, or at least two main ones that I can think of. There might be others too, but the first one would be you get ice formation like tundra. Where there's no soil base, and then lichens and moss and stuff start to invade and create a soil base. Um, the other one that is probably a little more familiar to us, or that would make a little more sense, would be um, volcanic action. So, um, if you get a volcano, like if you think about Hawaii, like especially when the ones that are slower erupting, not just like one kind of big bang, but like the ones that continually erupt slowly, they're constantly kicking out lava, which then cools and hardens into bare rock. So that would be an example of like how like what would happen that would allow primary succession to occur. When that lava cools and it's just bare rock, then there's no soil base, no nothing, and then you would get primary succession occurring where moss and lichens and things like that invading and starting the soil base. Okay, so primary succession is just that, going from like any kind of area like a tundra or bare rock or gravel with no soil base to creation of a soil base. That's all primary succession is. All right. Secondary succession is then all the ones after that. It's a succession that starts with the pre-existing soils. There's soil based stuff there, and then progression from one biotic community to the next. So, for example, you get a prairie burned. The initial invaders, small grasses stuff, prepare the way for future successions. Small grasses come in, turn into tall grasses and shrubs, large bushes to small trees to large trees. So they give you an example in your book on page 104. Here, a picture of how succession in a system could look. So you get in year one, say after a fire or something like that, you get short grasses, crabgrasses, things like that growing in the first year. Then in years 1 through 3, you start getting tall grasses, herbaceous plants. So other sort of like flowers and taller plants like that. Some shrubs, and then in years 3 through 10, pine trees would start to develop and grow. And then in years 10 through 30, you would get pine forest development. Okay, a kind of a full-blown pine forest. And then in years 30 through 70, you would get hardwood trees coming in. So that would, you'd thinking like your oaks, stuff like that. Okay, and then 70 plus years, you're talking a hardwood forest climax. Okay, now this would be what's called a climax ecosystem. So let's take a look at that. A climax ecosystem is the final stage in ecological succession. So all of these, like switching from one of these to the next, that's secondary succession. So this is a succession, this is a succession, this is a succession, so on and so forth. Okay. So a climax ecosystem is the final stage in ecological succession. It's an ecosystem in which all populations of all organisms are in balance with each other and with existing abiotic factors. And another thing to know about a climax ecosystem is ecosystem. So when it says it's the final, it means ecosystem will stay at this stage unless a disturbance occurs. Okay. So it'll stay whatever that climax stage is unless you get some kind of a disturbance. Okay, so let's talk about disturbances. Disturbances are natural or human-induced event or process that interrupts ecological succession and creates new conditions on a site. Disturbances allow ecosystems that are not climax ecosystems to exist, which in turn increases biodiversity. All right, so disturbances can be categorized into two groups, biotic and abiotic. Again, biotic would be disturbances that come from living sources of living things, abiotic, non-living. So biotic disturbances, invasive species, that means species that normally don't live in that area that are either brought in or come in from migration or something. They're invasive, like invading. Okay. Human impacts, like agricultural land. So if you look, this is especially applicable to us around here. If you look around, most of our landscapes and most of our ecosystems really around this area are agricultural lands, farmlands. Now, I don't think any of us believe that if we all went away, that this whole, the whole Midwest or whatever would stay agricultural. It wouldn't stay corn and beans and stuff like that, even if we're not here. So that's an that's a disturbance that changes what the ecosystems are. Okay, now don't get the wrong impression that all disturbances are bad. Some can be harmful, some can be good, and some can be neutral. It just depends. Okay. And then C, what we call engineer species. These are species that actually, through actions that they take to live their lives, that they affect or alter the environment around them. Humans, we would be a major engineer species, obviously. But other ones like beavers. So beavers, obviously, we know build their houses, build dams. Um, they can change the ecosystem greatly by doing this. They chop down a lot of trees to build these, so that affects that part. They also, in building the dams, a lot of times they can actually, if they dam up a river, they can create lakes, which would change the entire ecosystem. That adds an aquatic ecosystem to a place that didn't have it before and takes away land ecosystem. Okay, so that would be a disturbance that would greatly impact the ecosystem. All right. Abiotic, non-living. Major weather events, volcanoes, as we already mentioned, the volcano can wipe an ecosystem back all the way to pre-primary succession. Okay. Floods, we've seen floods down in southern United States, New Orleans, areas like that are not only greatly affecting us as humans, but also the ecosystems around there. Tornadoes, hurricanes, things like that. Floods, hurricanes kind of go together with the New Orleans and that area. Um, Fires also could be considered a major weather event. But it's its own. It's not really a weather event. It's its own thing. And actually, it's really, if you've watched the news at all lately, it's pretty much the only thing outside of politics and stuff like that that's been on the news is wildfires in California and in the upper Northwest, um, Oregon and stuff, and how bad they are and how much they're burning and stuff. Um, Fire is actually necessary um, for certain ecosystems, so it's not all bad. Um, Fire can it resets ecological succession to a prior point. A lot of these disturbances will do that, but fire especially. They have what are special, excuse me, easy for me to say. They have special climax ecosystems called fire climax ecosystems. These are ecosystems that depend on fire to maintain their existence. So, one example of this is a prairie grass ecosystem. A prairie grass ecosystem uh, only exists if you get fire resetting the ecological succession. Because if you go back to this, okay, a prairie grass ecosystem is really sort of in here. The tall grass, like this. Prairie grass ecosystems aren't natural climax ecosystems. Like that's not the final stage. And if fire didn't occur, you really wouldn't get prairie grass ecosystems because they would eventually turn into forest ecosystems, and then there'd be nothing. So if there's no disturbance to reset it back here, then it doesn't. Eventually they wouldn't exist, and you'd lose all of the plants and animals that would exist in there. So a prairie grass, in order for a prairie grass ecosystem to exist, there needs to be fire, and some we actually, at Knox College, and where I did my undergrad in Galesburg, they had a 900-acre field study area, which had forests and rivers and lakes and prairie systems too, to do environmental studies. And they every 3 years they would um, every 3 years they would actually go in and on a rotating basis literally burn on purpose a section of the prairie ecosystem that they had there. And this is to this would allow it to reset and grow, and it would maintain a prairie ecosystem. Now, you wouldn't burn the whole entire thing because the animals and plants and stuff, they would need somewhere to go safely. So they would burn sections of it. Like they would burn essentially a third of it every 3 years. And then, the other 2/3, the animals would be able to escape to that and kind of live there. And then they would come back in and repopulate the one, but it would keep the prairie ecosystem going, which is a fire climax. So you can see pictures here on this of people doing prairie burns, literally just burning off the grasses. This prevents uh, the shrubs and small trees from. Oops, sorry. It prevents the shrubs and small trees from gaining a foothold in here in the years like 3 through 10, and like it prevents the woody shrubs and the pine trees from coming in and gaining a foothold and turning it into a forest. By burning it, it resets it. So that would be an example of a prairie grass ecosystem is an example of a fire climax ecosystem. All right, and that'll be the end of that. I will see you all soon, and I hope you have a good day.